Rivaled only by sleep, feeding, whether by the breast or the bottle or both, becomes the main event after a new child is born. Hundreds of hours of feeding, burping, sleeping, changing, feeding, burping, sleeping, changing, sleeping, changing, feeding, burping, sleeping, changing. Arguably the main work of new mothers is literally keeping the child alive. But feeding is also hugely politicised and controversial. Often women are shamed for the ways in which they feed their children. Would machine feeding take the sting out of the shame? Or do we always find new ways to shame women? And if we do, what does feeding teach us about being human? You are listening to Motherhood versus the Machine. This is a podcast about motherhood, but not just about motherhood. Not really. It's about what makes us human, what distinguishes us from machines, what can be automated and what could never replace the human touch. I'm Chine MacDonald, director of the religion think tank Theos. I'm also a mum of 2 little boys.
And I'm Dr. Madeline Pennington, head of research at Theos. I'm also a mum. I've got a young daughter and another baby on the way. This is not just a podcast for mothers, but for everyone. It's about what makes us human, what distinguishes us from machines.
We're now at the halfway point in our series. In our first episode, we explored the relationship between mothering and work and how our existing economic categories for labour are deeply inadequate.
The economy becomes somewhere that men and perhaps women who don't have children go to sell their labour, whilst women who are looking after children are then located outside the economy.
Our second episode unpacked the experience of growing and birthing a new person, and what we could gain or lose if we were to export that process to machines.
The first thing that we are is a part emerging from somebody else. We are first in relation. It's not something that you have to dramatically discover. It just is the first thing that is to be human.
In today's episode, we tackle one of the most controversial aspects of mothering. That's right, feeding.
We ask what our relationship to feeding can teach us about ourselves and society.
As many mothers will recognise, what it really is the worst case scenario of the familiar female double bind.
We take a field trip to learn how even the most iconic of mothers, the Virgin Mary, was shamed over breastfeeding.
The Victorians clearly had a problem with the idea of a depiction of even the tiniest amount of naked female breast.
And we discover a bit of both the human and the divine in one of the messiest aspects of mothering.
So it's quite hard imagery, perhaps a bit bloody for us. But for Julian, this is the most intimate, participative contact with Christ. And she says it's like the mother's milk.
Maddie, how was feeding for you?
Probably about a week before I had my daughter, my mum called me and she said, Maddie, I think you just need to hear that breastfeeding is hard and it is a full-time job. You're going to spend a lot of time feeding your child. And I remember at the time thinking, yeah, got it. It's hard. Going to take ages. Fine. How hard could that be? And then it turns out it is hard. And yes, it is a full-time job. I remember crying to my husband saying, I just really hate this. I think the only reason I didn't stop was because I just felt too exhausted to try changing anything about the routine. Just the sheer amount of time it takes is unbelievable. If they feed about once an hour when they're newborns, that might be 15 minutes of feeding, 20 minutes of burping, and then they fall asleep and then wake up after 20 minutes and they want another feed. And actually, I'm sure whether or not they've breastfed their children, most mothers would recognise the feeling of just getting into bed at night and just dreading what's about to happen. You're thinking, when am I next going to wake up? How's it going to be? How lonely will I feel or not?
The historian Sarah Knott calls the middle of the night maternity's most concealed past, hard to fathom, yet perhaps most important to the person mothering. And a huge part of that, I think, for quite a long time, is actually just your child wanting to eat at 2 a.m. So yeah, how did you find it?
This is bringing it all back. Both times with my sons, I pretty much stopped breastfeeding when I went back to work at about 9 months-ish. I kind of weaned my second child off a bit more slowly. And when I think about how I thought breastfeeding would be, I imagine the Madonna lactans, Mary feeding the infant Jesus and looking really serene and holding him in her arm and looking lovingly down at him. The reality was, after a 3-day labour, after a pretty traumatic experience, the first thing that happens after you see your baby is they're like, time to feed the baby. And I remember the midwife put my son at my boob, and I was like, what am I supposed to be? What am I supposed to be doing
Why
here?
now?
Why now? What? Right now in front of everyone? This is just a really alien experience. And his latch wasn't good, so they pretty quickly were like, oh, the baby's not getting enough, so we're going to give him formula. And so the first 24 hours of staying in the hospital after having given birth, I kept on being told, oh, it's not working. And then when we got moved to our room, they brought in this like industrial sized breast pump. They literally wheeled it into the room, and they were like, put this bit on your boob and try and express. And the sound of it was like this massive machine that is making me feel inadequate. I can't do it. I need this massive machine to help me do something that should be natural. So those are my kind of first few hours of breastfeeding. And that kind of challenge continued pretty much throughout my early months. We continued to combination feed, which is when you breastfeed and bottle feed with formula. And I remember hiding bottles. If I was out in public and needing to feed, I didn't want people to see that I was bottle feeding my child because I felt like there was this real, I don't know where it was coming from, but I just felt like I couldn't let people see that I was failing. After a few weeks, I think when my son was about 12 weeks old, I developed this like massive boil on my elbow. And I was like, what is this? And I remember going to the doctor and they said it was bursitis, which is basically a repetitive strain injury. And it had happened to me because I was so tense when I was breastfeeding. I was tensing up because it was painful, but also I didn't want to drop my precious child. And so that sensation of being really tense just developed this kind of massive thing on the end of my elbow. No one talked about that at NCT.
Yeah. That's it. No one talked about it. It's funny you say that you had to sit still as well. I would have loved to sit still, and it's such a good example of how everyone's experiences here are just going to have different challenges. My daughter, as much as I love her in general, this was the most annoying thing that she did, which was for about probably 2.5 months. She was on, I think, probably what we would call nursing strike, and she would only feed if I was bouncing her up and down whilst walking round the dining table. That was the only way I could get her to feed. And I think possibly that was the moment when I should have just stopped breastfeeding and tried other ways of getting her to feed. And again, it was the kind of exhaustion thing.
I remember this because we met up in a coffee shop.
I was like,
so I got to feed now. I'm going to walk around.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, it's so true that you are damned if you do, damned if you don't on this thing.
Now to a story that always sparks conversation. A Tempe mother caught up in a breastfeeding debate after a confrontation with her other child's assistant principal on the playground.
Team 12's Lisa Nico speaking to the woman about the heated situation. Lisa?
We first introduced you to Katie Carlson last month when a young pool manager in Willoughby told her she'd have to continue nursing her then 3-month-old baby in the bathroom.
I felt extremely embarrassed, shocked, and kind of like ashamed.
The mental impact on me of struggling to breastfeed was enormous. I remember crying a lot, feeling like I was just an inadequate parent, that I was failing my children. I felt very guilty. I know an awful lot of women talk about you feel guilty that your baby's not getting enough food. It's quite difficult for anyone to believe that you can really feed your baby just with your breasts. And a crisis of confidence is a big reason for a lot of women giving up. I remember looking down at her and apologising to her over and over again for not being a good enough mother.
As news headlines across the world demonstrate, how we feed our children isn't just a private issue. It concerns public policy and wider culture. Whatever you do, however you end up feeding your baby, it will be hard. You may feel judged and even shamed by society. We currently live in a decade and country that believes breast is best, but in the early 20th century, it was regarded as lower class and uncultured. As it turns out, the tensions around feeding have long political histories.
Throughout history, there would have been circumstances where women were unable to feed, perhaps because they were ill after the birth, or perhaps they needed to go somewhere for work.
That's Joanna Wohlfarth, cultural historian and the author of Milk, An Intimate History of Breastfeeding.
I had exactly the same misconception that breastfeeding was ahistorical, that it happened in a vacuum and wasn't subject to the same kind of societal or cultural pressures. So there was so much that I found surprising.
Her book explores how the customs and perceptions around feeding have changed across the centuries, even as much of the shame and stigma has remained constant.
So many cultures would have been really accepting of the practice of allo nursing, where it wasn't just the birth mother that fed the baby. Lots of different people within the kinship group or within the family group would have fed the baby, and that still happens in some cultures today. That's something that we in the West feel really uncomfortable with.
The alternatives to breastfeeding extend long before the development of formula in the 1900s.
I was also fascinated to find infant bottles dating back thousands of years, and they are the most beautifully made objects. Now, these probably wouldn't have been used as a replacement for breastfeeding, because obviously people would have known that without proper sanitation and sterilisation, this wouldn't have been a kind of safe way to feed newborns, but they were probably used during weaning as an alternative to breast milk.
She even came across nipple shields from the Victorian era.
Anybody who's had problems with latch will probably be familiar with nipple shields that we have today, these kind of flimsy silicone things. But coming across Victorian nipple shields made out of wood or glass or ivory, that was the thing that really made me go, okay, this is not a contemporary phenomenon. There have been technologies in place to help women breastfeed or to mitigate issues with breastfeeding for as long as women have breastfed.
The stark reality is that not all mothers can breastfeed, but all babies need to be fed to stay alive. In this regard, the machine has frequently been the mother's ally in the perennial challenge of breastfeeding. This isn't to say that its impact in the world of infant feeding has always been positive. It's important to say that World Health Organization global advice is still for mothers to exclusively breastfeed their children for the first 6 months of life, then continue alongside the introduction of other foods up to age 2 or beyond. Among other things, this reflects an absence of clean water and lack of access to sterilising equipment in many parts of the world, both of which are needed to make formula feeding safe. In this sense, sterilisers themselves are another aspect of the machine in the mix. This is hardly a side issue. One study from VoxDev estimated that Nestlé's notorious entry into low and middle income formula markets caused about 210,000 infant deaths per year in these countries at the peak of the controversy in 1981. But in other countries, many mothers who find themselves unable to breastfeed for any number of medical or social reasons, or who simply decide not to, are able to nourish their child with the help of a safe alternative. Today, for the many who are unable or don't want to breastfeed, formula has been an invaluable technology.
I also combi fed, so I used formula I expressed and fed my baby using express milk with a bottle. And it can be great for women who either can't or don't want to feed from their bodies, because obviously it is a lot of work and it is a lot of demand on our body.
In this sense, we might say we already have technologies that practically remove the need for a human body as the direct source of physical nourishment. Still, there will always be someone holding the bottle, holding the baby. And for those carers, the feeding of infants never happens in a vacuum. At many points in history, the alternative to breastfeeding was not the machine, but other women.
I suppose the other thing that I found really interesting was looking at the history of wet nursing, which obviously will come out of earlier histories of allo nursing. So wet nursing being where you employ somebody or you enslave somebody to feed the baby for you. And picking apart that history tells us so much about shifting attitudes towards mothers, babies, and breast milk, which also speak of some of the contradictions between what we are told to do as good mothers and the structural support that is in place for us to enable us to do the thing that we're being told we should do.
The history of wet nursing is ancient. It goes back thousands of years before Christ. But the practice has changed over time and signified different things. In the 18th century, for example, aristocratic families in Western Europe typically employed a wet nurse to do the feeding. This was partly because of an idea that sexual intercourse might somehow spoil the quality of the breast milk.
And of course, if you're wanting to produce lots of heirs, or if you want your wife to be back in the marital bed rather than busy feeding the baby, sometimes breastfeeding has a contraceptive effect. And so having a wet nurse was really important.
At the same time, there were some very contradictory messages about the dangers of wet nurses.
Even prior to that time, there was this idea that somehow a wet nurse could pass on her kind of undesirable traits because she's a lower class woman. And this is not just in Western Europe. We find this in texts throughout the world, instructions on how to select a wet nurse, whether that's what she looks like, her kind of personality, her characters, what languages she speaks.
Alongside the benefits of wet nurses, there was the fear that a wet nurse would pass something on, not just through the time she spent with the baby, but through her milk itself.
By about the 17th century, 18th century, we start to see particularly men, start worrying about what is being passed on. We have men writing pamphlets that suggest that some of their health problems in later life were due to having a kind of low-class wet nurse when they were infants. Obviously, as things like famine or syphilis break out in certain places, there's all these fears about what they're going to pass on.
So eventually, wet nursing goes out of fashion.
We have this idea that actually wet nursing, you don't want to give your baby to a lower class woman because she's going to pass on undesirable traits.
Many writers like philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau start advocating for biological mothers to nurse their own babies.
And he saw this as not just good motherhood, this is good for the state. It's important for the entirety of mankind. It's a real moral imperative.
That moral imperative around what mothers should or shouldn't do has persisted, along with its judgments in our society today.
We, I think, are so culturally confused and contradictory about the maternal body, the birthing body, breastfeeding, breast milk. So we are told that breastfeeding is best and breast milk is best. But then we're also, firstly, not given adequate support to breastfeed or just adequate support generally in the perinatal period. And then we're also told by certain people that breastfeeding is best and breast milk is brilliant, but it's also disgusting and yucky, and please don't do it in public, and we don't want to see it. Breast milk is some kind of contagion. We don't want to come near it.
As many mothers will recognise, what it really is the worst case scenario of the familiar female double bind.
That's Rachel Mers, Professor of Divinity at the University of Edinburgh. She's written about the impossible standard this sets up for women.
Sure, you can do what you like, but the entire society around you is telling you exactly what you're supposed to do, and usually 3 contradictory versions of it at once. And nobody is sitting with you talking to about, actually, we have a shared experience here, we have shared interest here, you will start on your own with the kid.
In the UK today, there's a popular notion that breast is best. Those who don't breastfeed can often feel like failures, as I did. But even for those who do breastfeed, there are other social pressures.
The sort of advice you get given about breastfeeding to do with not only what you eat and don't eat, but also what environmental contaminants you might be exposed to. So you're also telling women that the economic and social conditions within which they exist are something that they're meant to absolutely control in order to control the milk.
There are endless ways we blame and shame mothers.
And some of the ways that we talk about mothering, pregnancy, breastfeeding suggest that this one individual has to become personally responsible for controlling the flow into her. And that is just not how it works.
It places responsibility on the individual, rather than the structural institutions and social policies that shape the individual's options and environment. For example, pregnant mothers are told not to smoke, but air pollution can be just as harmful at increasing the risk of miscarriage. Various studies suggest that racial inequalities lead to worse birth outcomes for both mother and infant. And not having a stable home is correlated with preterm birth and low birth weight.
One wants to push back against it politically because of what it does to women's understanding of themselves, to the attribution of blame and the emergence of shame, guilt, all of these things, the way that it turns things that are wider social concerns and worries into individualised phenomena of maternal shame and guilt. The phenomenon of breastfeeding over pregnancy is a different mode of experiencing one's relatedness to and dependence on a physical and social environment. And that needs to be recognised as well.
The history of breastfeeding and our views towards it shows just how socially politicised mother's milk is, and always has been. Even as so much of those societal perceptions and physical processes have been outside of an individual's control.
That, I think, is incredibly culturally embedded, and we can trace that back over millennia, right back to kind of classical antiquity, this idea that somehow women are a lower state of being compared to men, that women's bodies are more animal, that our bodies are more messy, more unruly, that we are somehow closer to nature, and that is a bad thing.
At the same time, there's also a kind of sanctity around mother's milk in many religious contexts.
I think to anybody that is familiar with kind of the Mary iconography, breast milk, obviously in some contexts is revered, it's magical stuff, it's metaphorical, it's akin to salvation. But also for a long time, there was a kind of a medical belief that breast milk was menstrual blood that was transformed, and menstrual blood is gross, right? So we're really conflicted, I think. And I think that puts mothers particularly in a really difficult space.
So Maddy and I had the chance to explore how some of these tensions play out in various artistic and religious representations of nursing motherhood.
Yes, this was really vividly portrayed to me when I visited York Minster. I went there to see a sculpture of one of the most literally iconic mothers, the Virgin Mary. As it turns out, even this ultimate mother had trouble with feeding.
I am here in York Minster with the Very Reverend Dominic Barrington, Dean of York, and we're here on a discovery of depictions of Mary. Dominic, tell me about how Mary is generally being depicted in York Minster. Are there many depictions of Mary here?
There are a surprising number of depictions of Mary for a historic cathedral which went through the Reformation. The king's men that came to sort out this place in the 16th century were soft-hearted in that regard.
But we're here looking at a particular one of the most surprising, in fact, redone not after the Reformation, but after the fire that struck York Minster in 1840.
Yes, we are here in the nave of the Minster. It's the highest and widest medieval nave in the country. And in 1840, as you said, there was a fire and it took out the entire ceiling and roof of the nave. And in doing so, it took out a wonderful collection of roof bosses, carved, painted decorations that depicted the life of Jesus from infancy to adulthood.
And of course, at the start of his life, there's that connection with his mother. So we're looking up at one of Mary feeding the infant Jesus, but there's something unusual about this depiction, isn't there?
There certainly is. I should explain that in the decade before this fire happened, an art historian had done very detailed studies of lots of the artwork in the cathedral, including these roof bosses. And in the restoration work after the fire, essentially the Dean in Chapter wanted to restore like for like. But the second of these bosses is a depiction of Mary feeding the baby Jesus. And that was slightly problematic for the Victorians, whose prudity is well known. Now, the bosses are pretty much exactly 100 feet above our heads, and it's not easy with the naked eye to see too much of the detail, but the Victorians clearly had a problem with the idea of a depiction of even the tiniest amount of naked female breast. So we possess, and I think this may be unique to York Minster, we possess a beautiful image of Mary giving the baby Jesus a bottle.
We have heard how so much of the cultural baggage around feeding can be unhelpful and shaming of women. But the feeding of infants has also been drawn on as a powerful image in more positive senses too. The 14th century Christian mystic and anchorite Julian of Norwich famously deployed maternal imagery, and especially feeding imagery, to express her understanding of God's love. Julian was the first woman known to have written in the English language.
She calls God Mother and she calls Jesus Mother at different times.
That's medical ethicist and theologian Claire Gilbert. Claire is also the author of I, Julian, a novel based on the mystic's life. I spoke to Claire about Julian's writings and what she can teach us today.
What she's showing us is a God who has the completely unconditional love that we typically see in a mother. Which is to say, at no point ever, anywhere, does God's love cease. It's quite medieval, but can I just read this to you? So this is from her Revelations of Divine Love. And she writes this: "The mother may give her child to suck her milk, but our precious mother Jesus, he may feed us with himself, and doeth so full courteously and full tenderly, with the blessed sacrament, the bread and wine, that is precious food of very life. The mother may lean the child tenderly to her breast, but our tender mother Jesus, he may homely lead us into his blessed breast by his sweet open side, giving the same understanding in this sweet word where he saith, Lo, how I love thee." So it's quite hard imagery, perhaps a bit bloody for us, that we enter the pierced side of Christ. But for Julian, this is the most intimate, participative contact with Christ, to participate in his body and blood as we do at the Eucharist. And she says it's like the mother's milk. And you imagine the mother holding the child to the breast And what a tender action that is of care and protection and nourishment. And that's the image that she uses to help us understand how Jesus, she calls him, how Jesus sees us and holds us.
I'm really glad you mentioned that specific passage, because that is so theologically rich in terms of the links between breastfeeding and particularly the love of God. And it's interesting to me that most maternal imagery draws on those very embodied moments of either breastfeeding or labour. It's often kind of the pains of childbirth that are drawn on. But what I found interesting reading back Julian of Norwich is that there's other things as well. She talks about the grounding and the rooting. She talks about the increasing of the person being the work of the mother, and also that basically work itself being a mothering quality. There's a bit where she talks about the mother changes her working but not her love over time, which I thought was a beautiful phrase. So she's drawing out lots of different qualities actually in her discussion, isn't she?
Yes, she is. And at one point she says, I think it's as strong as this, that this precious word mother, this beautiful word mother, and everything that it means, it is God. As if mother and God are synonyms.
Drawing on Claire's expertise as a medical ethicist, we also spoke about how her reading of theology had informed her approach to questions around technology more generally.
Technology itself isn't a problem. What's a problem is the mindset that we bring to it. And this is an idea from Heidegger, who talks about the technological mindset. You might say, we are the inheritors of a mindset born of the Reformation, the Enlightenment, the Industrial Revolution, which gave humans the idea that we were to control nature, to dominate nature. And it's summed up in Descartes' statement that we should become masters and possessors of nature, that humanity has the rationality to do that. Nature doesn't. Nature has no mind or sensibility. And if you think of nature as a machine, technological mindset, then it's there to serve you. It hasn't got an intrinsic value. So you see a forest, its value is in the timber that you would get from it or the paper that you would make from it. And the way round, I feel, we should be looking at this is how can we serve nature? Yes, develop technologies, but in order to serve nature, to restore nature. And we're included in that, of course. Our health and nature's health, it's the same thing. Charles Taylor calls it the buffered mindset. What we want is porosity, a sense of interdependence, and also of discipleship. And I would say, in relation to motherhood, honestly, it isn't the technology. We're quarrelling with the wrong thing if we say, I don't know, don't have IVF or don't have breastfeed, or that's not, it's why are you doing this? What is the purpose of this? It's what is it in service of? Always, whatever the technology is. So yes, if it's therapeutic, is it compassionate? But for whom is it therapeutic? For whom is it compassionate? Are also, of course, part of that question. And this is just to bring it back to Julian. The thing about Julian is that the attitude that she brings to her revelations is that same attitude of porous receptivity. It's engaged, she's listening, she's learning, she doesn't think she knows best. And it's that same attitude I think we can then adopt in relation to the creation.
I love how Claire draws from the maternal imagery not as insight only in its own right, but also as pointing to a wider posture that we can find in Julian of Norwich, one that connects not only to the parent-child relationship or the divine-human relationship, but also to how humans relate to the world and nature itself. Maybe there's something here that can speak to all of us, not just mothers. In fact, one of the paintings of nursing motherhood that is most moving to me wasn't done by a woman at all. Okay, right. How should we stand or sit? What do you want to do? Let's start.
I would say let's stand as close to it as possible,
okay,
because then we can also sort of claim that space.
I've come to the National Gallery to see a painting that tells a story of the sacredness and the ordinariness of breastfeeding. And I have just the person to help me.
My name is Reverend Dr. Ayla Lepine, and I'm the Associate Rector at St. James's Piccadilly in London. And prior to that, I was the Amundsen Fellow in Art and Religion here at the National Gallery. I had this idea way back in the middle of lockdown to do an exhibition that would pair 9 of the National Gallery's most unexpected as well as most famous paintings, with 1 painting each from 9 regional galleries and 1 place of worship, which was Canterbury Cathedral around the UK. And the idea there was to create conversations between works of art that expressed and that really got into the richness and the possibilities of St. Paul's list of the fruit of the Spirit in Galatians chapter 5, verse 22. So to be able to understand how in some way we can be more loving, we can experience patience and indeed impatience, where and how generosity is possible, or for many people not possible in our world today. We are in room 29 at the National Gallery, and at the moment this room really emphasizes 16th century Italian painting. And one of the most important Italian Renaissance artists from this period is someone called Titian. But this picture in the National Gallery is one of the least known of Titian's paintings. It's called The Virgin Suckling the Infant Christ. It's a very intimate picture, and in my Fruits of the Spirit project, I really wanted to see what would happen if this picture could represent the theme of love.
Now, I could easily have walked past this painting and not seen it as a traditional archetypal Virgin and Child, Mother and Child, Madonna and Child. What makes this a Madonna and Child or Virgin and Child?
I love that question, because one of the things that makes this a Mother of God and her infant son, Jesus, the Son of God, is just the title. If Titian had given this a different title, Mother and Child, then we wouldn't necessarily connect this with that notion of the divine, the Blessed Virgin Mary, Our Lady, and the infant Christ. One of the reasons for that is that this picture is very ordinary. In a way, it could be many different mothers, it could be many different children, and there are no halos. The interior is actually quite dark, the colors are quite muted, and it's painted in this really loose way. You can almost see the way the baby's little toes blend into the mother's skirt. You can see this amazing use of paint in order to express the little tendrils of the textile on the shawl. You can really see the redness of the baby's cheeks. And when I've looked at this painting with mothers, they have told me that they think this baby might be teething, and there's something about the way that Jesus, as it turns out, is almost writhing on Mary's lap, trying to get comfortable, trying to figure out how to create that bond, which is ultimately a nourishing bond.
There are lots of traditional Madonna and Child images where there's a very regal mother feeding a small god. There's also a lot of flesh on display, and this really feels like an image that is about the body.
Mm. There is a real connection, which we don't see in art very often, between the body of the child and the body of the mother. Look at Mary's hand holding the muslin, holding this kind of gentle, sort of small diaphanous fabric around Christ's lower back. And then look at Christ's hand and the way that his hand is attached to and pulling his mother's breast close to his mouth so that he can be fed. The gestures of their hands, where their fingers are positioned, are almost identical. So this is Titian being very intentional. He could have painted hands in any way he wanted, but here he's demonstrating this ineffable bond almost at a kind of genetic level. Here, this is a very subtle and I think very powerful demonstration that as mother and child, human and human, they are kin, they are connected. Hands are really precious. Mary's hands are the hands that hold Jesus when Jesus is a baby, and the hands that cradle Jesus at the Pietà after he dies on the cross. And she, in her wild sorrow, mourns in a way which artists typically depict as being quite private, but not always. This is a private image of a bond that only mother and child can really understand. It is so human and so personal, and I think it's deeply relatable. That it was painted by a 16th century white man in Italy is also really interesting. He is noticing these things about motherhood, and yet he himself, of course, was never a mother. So the insight that he seems to have into flesh, feeding, body, the mother and child relationship is, to me, quite surprising, as well as quite moving and emotive.
Maddy, what I loved about visiting the Titian painting was that it was so ordinary. It was earthy and embodied, and I could really relate to it in a way that I couldn't relate to these kind of idealised images of breastfeeding that I've seen most of my life.
Or even censored images of breastfeeding, like at York Minster.
Yeah, exactly. So part of what made breastfeeding such a shocking experience for me was this kind of the grueling reality of it in comparison with these idealised images, these kind of nursing images, these kind of perfect, serene images. And what I can now see from the conversations that we've had in this episode is that those images and that idealisation reflects many of the kind of social anxieties around feeding that are actually nothing new. They've been around for a long time. The reality of breastfeeding is really, really gritty. It's really, really animalistic. I remember breastfeeding and feeling like an animal in many ways, like a cow or a horse or a pig. But clearly I wasn't any less of a mother when I was using the saviour of a bottle to feed my child.
Yeah, I think there's also something from the child's perspective there, isn't there? I mean, I think as adults, we spend basically most of our life trying to forget that we are animals, that we're mammals. And that realisation that of how embodied and vulnerable we are, that same realisation applies whether the baby is being fed by breast or bottle. In both cases, there's that same experience of having to stick with something hard, of how often they need to feed, how around the clock it is, and how self-sacrificial it is at the heart of it. There's, it's just something very stripped back about a baby needing milk and a mother or a parent giving it.
And that's what I found so profound about that Titian painting, which is like you could almost have walked past it. It just looked so ordinary. It was a mum feeding a baby, but it's in that kind of ordinariness that I think we find something beautiful, something potentially sacred. The very basic need of needing to be nourished by milk, needing to be fed by our mother. And there is something really profound, I think, in the kind of Christian ideas about our daily bread, about being nourished by God. We got a bit of that from Julian of Norwich as well. It's kind of very basic, but yet beautiful sense that we get from the act of feeding.
Yeah, and as Mary Harrington notes, that, for Christians or in Christian theology, the incarnation itself shows that our embodied nature is not like a design flaw, like a machine might have a design flaw, but it's something that God enters and redeems. There's something in that for me that is really the kind of fundamental paradox of this whole episode and probably the previous episode as well, that actually in our most animalistic moments, our most mammalian moments, like those are places that as a society we have located glimpses of the divine, and some have obviously been better at doing that positively, say Julian of Norwich, or I think that's basically what those idealised pictures are trying to get at, even though they're not always helpful for women, is that there is something here that reflects not just what it means to be human, but the ways in which we are most transcendent. So although in a Western modern society we find that kind of close encounter with our bodies very difficult, that extreme experience of embodiment is actually a gateway into new spiritual lessons and growth, and above all, a gateway into an experience of deep, profound love. And that's not to say that those experiences are divine in themselves, or that qualities are, human qualities are divine in themselves, but that they can point to something bigger than human nature.
You're almost making me want to go back to try breastfeeding again, but actually never again.
Yeah.
On our next episode, we reflect on one of the most painful aspects of motherhood and many parents' nightmare.
Almost without exception, these were women who had lost children.
We wrestle with the challenges of grief and change.
I think there's an almost universal experience of parenthood, which is that we can have these dreams and ideas about what it's going to be like, but it's always different.
And we discover the startling ways in which loss can open us up to a deeper understanding of ourselves and the world.
It's the same as if you get really sick and it's a matter of life and death. You suddenly have a different perspective and you're like, okay, what actually matters?
Death, loss and change, and what hope might look like in the midst of a broken world. That's all in our final episode.
You have been listening to Motherhood versus the Machine from the think tank Theos, hosted by Chinny MacDonald and me, Dr. Madeleine Pennington. Stephanie Tam is our executive producer, David Benjamin Blower is our audio editor and sound designer, and Daniel Turner is our assistant producer and recording engineer. Our thanks to the Fetzer Institute for generously funding this project.